It was 1 a.m. when Martha heard the loud bang echo from the living room. She had just finished washing the last of the dinner dishes, a simple chicken soup, the kind she'd made for David ever since he was a boy. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm and made with love. She hadn't seen David in hours, but his footsteps pounding through the hall were unmistakable. The door to her bedroom burst open, and there he stood, towering over her, rage burning in his eyes. "You can't even make a proper meal," he yelled, his voice shaking the walls. Martha didn't even flinch anymore. After all these years, she'd learned to brace for the storm. But tonight was different. His face twisted with fury as he grabbed the bowl of soup from the table and threw it in her face. The hot liquid burned her cheek, and the porcelain shards cut her lip. "You're useless," he shouted, grabbing her by the arm and shoving her into the kitchen wall with a force that left her breathless. Her head slammed against the tiles. The pain was sharp, but it wasn't the physical pain that made her feel broken. It was the humiliation. Her son, the boy she'd raised alone after her husband left them, had turned on her in the most brutal way. As Martha wiped away the blood from her split lip, she realized something that had been growing in her for a while. She wasn't just tired of the beatings. She was done. Done being controlled. Done being afraid. For years, she had let him take control of her life. Her house, her money, her dignity. But that night, as the sting from the soup seared her face, something inside her snapped. She knew it was time to take a stand. She couldn't take another day in this prison. The sun had barely risen when Martha dragged herself out of bed. The house, once filled with the laughter of family, now felt cold and empty. She could still hear David's cruel words echoing in her head. But today, she knew something had changed. She couldn't keep living this way. Martha was 62. She had spent 40 years as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, always putting others first. After working long shifts, she would come home to a quiet, modest house she had bought with her own hard-earned money. She lived a simple life, always putting others ahead of her own needs. But in the last few years, the house she once loved had become a prison. David, her only son, was once the boy who hugged her tightly every night before bed. She had worked tirelessly to give him everything he needed, even though they barely had enough. When his father walked out on them when David was just 8, Martha made a promise to herself that she would never let her son feel abandoned. She gave him everything: school, piano lessons, clothes, and trips they couldn't afford just to see him smile. But things had started to change about 3 years ago. David came home one night after his divorce, suitcase in hand, asking to stay with her until he got back on his feet. Like a fool, Martha opened the door and let him back in. She thought he would just need a little help, until she realized she had invited a monster into her home. In the beginning, everything seemed fine. David would go to work and come home at night. They'd sit down to dinner, talk about his day, and for a while it felt like the family life Martha had always dreamed of. But soon enough, little comments started to slip through. "Mom, why is the house always a mess?" Or, "Can't you make something better for dinner?" At first, Martha brushed them off, thinking it was just stress from the divorce. Then, the real changes began. David started making comments about her finances. "Mom, you're getting older. You shouldn't be handling so much money on your own," he'd say. He convinced her that managing her pension was too complicated for someone her age, so she handed it over. He said he would manage it better for her. 6 months later, Martha realized she had no control over her own bank account. Her monthly pension checks were going into David's account, and he only gave her a meager $100 a week for personal expenses. When she asked him about it, he'd shrug it off, saying, "It's for your own good, trust me." And then came Lila, the woman who would become David's second wife. She was young, elegant, and always treated Martha like an invisible servant. Every time she came over, Martha would make sure everything was perfect. She'd cook, clean, and smile as if everything was fine. But inside, it was suffocating. David had changed. The sweet boy she raised was now a man who yelled at her, belittled her, and controlled her every move. But Martha still tried to please him, still cooked the meals he demanded, cleaned the house to perfection, and did everything he asked, because deep down she still loved him. He was her son, after all. But last night, when David slammed that soup bowl into her face, Martha realized that love alone wasn't enough anymore. She had to fight for her life. David was no longer the boy she once knew, and Martha couldn't afford to be a prisoner in her own home any longer. The next morning, Martha woke up with a headache and a sore body. Her lip throbbed, and her arms were covered in fresh bruises, but the physical pain was nothing compared to what had happened the night before. As she stared at herself in the bathroom mirror, she saw the woman she had become, a woman who had let her son treat her like this for far too long. The reflection staring back at her was someone she barely recognized, but there was no time to dwell on it. David would be awake soon, and he'd demand his breakfast. It had always been the same routine. Up at dawn, prepare his meal, make sure everything was perfect. No room for mistakes. Martha had long ago learned that if she slipped up, the consequences would be harsh. As the sun barely began to rise, Martha entered the kitchen, her heart already heavy with dread. She glanced at the clock, 6:30 a.m. David was already sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, his suit crisp and freshly pressed, as always. "Breakfast," he said without even looking up, his tone flat and dismissive. "Make it quick." Martha forced a smile, though it felt more like a mask than an expression of warmth. She went through the motions, preparing scrambled eggs just the way David liked them, with 3 spoonfuls of shredded cheese, 2 slices of toast, and black coffee with no sugar. Her hands shook as she laid the meal out in front of him, but she said nothing. David barely glanced at her as he dug into the food, as though it was nothing more than a routine. Martha watched him from the corner of her eye, waiting for his inevitable criticism. He always found something wrong, no matter how hard she tried. "Mom, you burned the toast." "Again," he muttered, pushing the plate aside as if the meal had offended him. Martha could already feel the anger rising in him. The flash of disappointment in his eyes made her stomach churn. "You're always so careless," David continued. "Do you know how embarrassing this is? How are you going to get anything right when it's always like this?" Martha nodded quietly, trying to hold back the tears threatening to escape, but she knew better than to cry in front of him. It only made things worse. Just as David took another bite, the front door opened. Lila stepped inside, looking perfectly put together in a light green dress, heels clicking on the hardwood floor. She greeted David with a smile, kissing him on the cheek. "Good morning, Mrs. Davis," she said to Martha, but the words felt like a hollow greeting, nothing more than a formality. "How are you today?" Lila asked sweetly, her voice dripping with fake concern, but Martha could see through it. She could always see through Lila's carefully crafted smile. "I'm fine, thank you," Martha replied, her voice barely audible. "Are you going to have some breakfast, Lila?" Before Lila could answer, David shot a glance at Martha, his eyes narrowing. The warning was clear. One wrong word, and tonight would be worse than ever. David then turned to Lila, pretending everything was fine, as if he hadn't just shouted at his mother. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made Martha shudder. "Look, Mom," he said, his tone turning almost casual. "I bought you some makeup. It's perfect for covering those little scrapes you got last night." Scrapes. He called the bloody gash on her lip a scrape. It was insulting. It was degrading. But Martha said nothing. She simply took the makeup, a brand that cost more than $50, and tucked it into her pocket. She knew he had probably bought it with her own retirement money. He'd been managing her finances for years now, claiming it was for her own good. She didn't have access to any of it. Not a single cent of her pension had been in her control for 2 years. David had made sure of that. As Lila sat down at the table and began sipping her coffee, the room fell silent, and Martha couldn't help but think of all the lies she'd told over the past few years. How many times had she covered up the bruises, making excuses about falls and accidents. How many times had she lied to friends, to neighbors, to herself? David had her trapped in this cycle of fear, humiliation, and lies. The worst part was that Lila didn't seem to notice any of it. She smiled and chatted with David as though nothing was wrong. Martha was invisible to them, a servant in her own home, but something was different today. Martha knew she couldn't keep pretending anymore. When David got up to leave, he leaned in close to her, his voice low but threatening. "Remember what we talked about last night?" he whispered. "If you ever say anything to anyone, you'll regret it. No one will believe you. You're just an old woman living off my charity." The words stung, but they didn't have the same power over her anymore. Martha knew it was time to act. She had to stop being afraid. She had to stop hiding. The house was eerily quiet after David and Lila left. Martha sat in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of her once happy home. The old kitchen table, the place where family meals had been shared, now felt like a tomb. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, as though the house itself was waiting for her to do something. Martha ran her fingers across the edge of the table, her mind racing. She had been so careful, hiding her bruises, making excuses for David's behavior. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse. David had been abusing her for years, emotionally, physically, financially. But Martha wasn't the only one who knew the truth anymore. Grace, her neighbor, had been keeping an eye on things for a while. She had noticed the bruises, the marks on Martha's arms, the way she would flinch when David raised his voice. Grace had been the first to ask if she needed help, but Martha had always brushed her off, pretending everything was fine. But not today. Today, Martha was ready. The first step was getting the proof. She had to document everything, every bruise, every threat, every financial misdeed. She needed to take back control of her life. Later that afternoon, Grace arrived at Martha's door. Martha had called her over in secret, asking for help. Grace had brought along a small USB drive. "Here," Grace said quietly, handing Martha the drive. "I've been recording his threats for the past few weeks. Every word he said to you, I've got it on here. And I've been keeping track of the money transfers. David is using your bank account for his own business. It's all on this drive." The weight of the USB drive in Martha's hand felt heavier than she expected. It was more than just a piece of technology. It was her ticket out. Martha could feel her heart race as she plugged the USB into her laptop. She opened the folder and saw everything. Audio files of David's threats, proof of the fraudulent bank transfers, even a list of transactions she had never authorized. The depth of David's manipulation was clear. Martha was no longer just his victim. She was an accomplice in his crimes, though unknowingly. But it wasn't just the financial abuse. The recordings Grace had gathered also showed David's cruel words and violent threats. Martha listened to the audio, her hands trembling as she heard David yell at her, belittle her, and threaten to throw her out of the house. She heard him tell her that no one would believe her if she ever told anyone what had been happening. She could almost hear the smirk in his voice as he said it. The worst part was that, at the time, Martha had believed him. She had been so broken, so isolated, that she didn't think anyone would care. But now, with the evidence right in front of her, she felt something shift inside. David might have thought he could control her, but he was wrong. Martha knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed more than just Grace's help. She needed professional help. Grace had already arranged for her to meet with a lawyer, Brenda, who specialized in cases of domestic abuse and financial fraud. The lawyer would be able to guide her through the next steps, and maybe, just maybe, help her take David down. The day of the meeting with Brenda came quickly. Martha was nervous. She had spent so many years living in fear that the thought of confronting David felt impossible. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about taking back control of her life, about stopping David before he could hurt anyone else, especially Lila. When Martha arrived at Brenda's office, she was greeted warmly by the lawyer, who had already reviewed the evidence. Brenda was a woman in her 40s with a calm demeanor that immediately put Martha at ease. "Martha," she said, offering a comforting smile, "what we have here is a clear case. You've been manipulated and abused for far too long. David can't get away with this anymore. We'll file the appropriate paperwork and start the legal process." But even as Brenda spoke, Martha felt a heavy weight in her chest. The reality of what she was about to do was sinking in. She was going to confront her son, the same boy she had loved and raised. She had no idea how David would react when he found out she was taking action against him. "I can't do this alone," Martha whispered, her voice shaking. "What if he gets violent again? What if he hurts me even more?" Brenda placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone, Martha. We have the evidence. We have witnesses. David can't escape the truth, and you will be safe. I promise you." As Martha walked out of the lawyer's office, a strange sense of peace settled over her. She was taking the first step towards freedom. No more hiding. No more lies. The morning of the confrontation arrived with an unsettling sense of dread hanging in the air. Martha hadn't slept much the night before. She kept replaying the events in her mind. How she would face David, how she would look him in the eye and tell him everything she'd been hiding. Would he lash out again? Would he try to manipulate her into backing down? The fear felt suffocating, but at the same time, there was something else, something powerful beginning to rise inside her. It was a feeling she hadn't had in years. Courage. That morning, David was already sitting at the kitchen table, dressed in a sharp blue suit and scrolling through his phone as if nothing had changed. He didn't even acknowledge Martha as she entered, which was typical. She had been invisible to him for so long, her presence nothing more than a servant in his eyes. "Breakfast," he said without looking up. "Don't take too long." Martha glanced at the clock, 7:15 a.m. The ritual continued. Eggs, toast, coffee, all prepared with precision, all served with a smile she no longer felt. As she plated his meal, the weight of the decision she had made felt heavier than ever. This was it. No more pretending, no more silence. When Martha placed the plate in front of him, David finally looked up, taking a long, slow gaze at the food before his eyes narrowed. "Do you know how embarrassing it is to have a mother who can't even make breakfast properly?" he snapped, pushing the plate aside. "The toast is burnt again. You're pathetic." His words stung, but Martha didn't flinch this time. She stood still, her hands shaking slightly, but her resolve growing stronger with each passing second. "No, David," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to keep letting you control me." His expression changed in an instant. For the first time, David's arrogance faltered, and the fury in his eyes burned even brighter. "What did you just say?" he hissed, his voice low, dangerous. "I said I'm done being your punching bag," Martha continued, her heart racing. "I'm not your servant, and I'm not going to live in fear anymore. I'm filing charges against you. You've been abusing me for years, both physically and financially, and you've been stealing my money. It ends today." David's face twisted with disbelief, his lips curling into a sneer. He shot up from the table, knocking the chair back in the process. The sound echoed in the silence of the kitchen. His eyes were wild with rage, and for a moment, Martha could almost see the boy he once was. The boy who used to cry in her arms when he scraped his knee. The boy who trusted her. But that boy was long gone. "You think I'll let you ruin everything?" he barked, stepping closer to her, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think I'll let you take me down with your lies?" Martha stood her ground. "You've been lying to everyone, David. To me, to Lila, to everyone. You've stolen from your company. You've used me to cover up your mess, and I'm not going to let you get away with it anymore. I have proof. I've got recordings, bank statements, everything I need." David laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and cruel. "You're nothing. You've always been nothing to me. You think anyone will believe you? You're just an old woman, fading away. Nobody cares about you." The words were meant to wound, but Martha didn't let them. Her heart was beating in her ears, but her voice stayed steady. "I've spent my life taking care of you, giving you everything. But I'm done. I won't protect you anymore, David, and I won't let you destroy me." She paused, her breath catching for a moment, then spoke with finality. "You're not my son anymore. You're a stranger who's taken everything from me." For the first time in years, David seemed to hesitate. It was brief, just a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But it was there. Martha saw it, and in that moment, she knew he was afraid of being exposed, afraid of losing his power. But that hesitation didn't last long. With a roar, David lunged at her, grabbing her by the wrist with enough force to make her gasp. "You think you can ruin me?" he spat. "I'll make sure you regret this." The grip on her arm tightened, and Martha felt the familiar surge of fear rise in her chest. But this time, something was different. She wasn't just afraid anymore. She was angry. Angry at herself for letting this go on for so long. Angry at David for making her feel small. Before David could take another step, there was a loud bang at the door, the sound of Clarice, her neighbor, banging on the front door, calling out, "Martha, are you all right? I heard yelling." David froze, his face going pale. The door shook with the force of Clarice's knocking, and Martha took a deep breath. This was her moment. "Get out," she said firmly, pulling her wrist out of his grasp. "Get out of my house, David. You don't control me anymore." David opened his mouth to protest, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. He gave Martha one last glare, filled with hatred, before he stormed off, slamming the door behind him. Clarice rushed into the kitchen, her eyes wide with concern. She took one look at Martha, at the bruises, the blood on her lip, the terror in her eyes, and immediately stepped into action. "Let's get you out of here," Clarice said softly. "We've got everything we need. The lawyer's already on her way. You're safe now." The weight of the decision Martha had made only hit her once the door slammed behind David. Her entire body shook with a mixture of fear and relief. The house, which had been a cage for so long, felt strangely empty now. No more sounds of his commands, no more threats echoing through the walls, but the silence was almost as deafening as the chaos she had lived through for years. Clarice was by her side in an instant, guiding Martha to the couch where she collapsed, her body exhausted from years of carrying the emotional weight of abuse. "Martha," Clarice said gently, sitting beside her, "this is just the beginning. We've got the evidence now. The lawyer will help you. It's time to take the next step." As the day passed, Martha sat in a daze, her mind reeling from the confrontation, the courage it had taken to finally stand up to her son, and the overwhelming fear of what would come next. She knew David would retaliate. He wouldn't go down without a fight. He would use every weapon he had, his lies, his manipulation, his threats, to try to stop her. But Martha was done being afraid. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. It was Brenda, the lawyer. Martha had barely slept the night before, but now she felt a surge of energy as she picked up the call. "We filed the papers," Brenda said, her voice calm but strong, "and I've arranged for a meeting with the authorities to get the charges filed. Your son won't get away with this. We'll make sure of that." It was a small victory, but it was enough to give Martha hope. David might be able to hide behind his charm and his money for a while, but the truth was catching up with him. He could no longer control Martha, and soon he wouldn't be able to control anyone. The following morning, Martha made her way to the courthouse with Clarice and Brenda by her side. As they entered the building, the gravity of what Martha was doing hit her all over again. This wasn't just about her. This was about putting an end to David's cycle of abuse, not just for her, but for anyone he might hurt in the future. Martha walked through the halls of the courthouse, her head held high. The legal proceedings moved quickly. She provided the evidence, the recordings, the bank statements, the proof of David's manipulation. And as the day wore on, the reality of what was happening sank in. At the end of the day, Martha sat in front of the judge, the room filled with the sharp scent of polished wood and the hum of hushed conversations. David was already in custody, but Martha had to face him in court. She could see him across the room, sitting with his lawyer, his face contorted in disbelief. David had always thought he was untouchable. But today, Martha was here, and for the first time in years, David wasn't in control. The judge reviewed the documents, listening to Martha's testimony. The room was still, the tension palpable. Martha spoke, her voice shaking but unwavering, describing the years of abuse, the theft, the emotional manipulation. As she spoke, she could feel a weight lifting off her shoulders, as though the years of suffering were finally being acknowledged. When it was over, the judge looked at David and his lawyer, then turned to Martha. Based on the evidence presented and the seriousness of the charges, the judge began, I am issuing an order for David Davis to remain in custody until his trial. This court takes domestic abuse and financial fraud very seriously, and there is enough evidence to move forward with charges. Martha sat back, her heart racing. She had done it. The truth was out. David was being held accountable for his actions, and Martha could finally breathe. As the judge's gavel came down, signaling the official end of David's brief court hearing, Martha felt a rush of emotions flood her chest. Relief, fear, empowerment. The journey wasn't over, but this was the first step toward a life without fear. After the hearing, Martha was surrounded by friends and supporters. Clarice stayed close, offering comfort and strength. Brenda was optimistic, but she knew there was still work to be done. The next steps would involve a deeper investigation into David's financial crimes. Martha left the courthouse that day, feeling a sense of power she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer the woman who cowered in fear. She was the woman who had fought for herself and won. But the real challenge was only just beginning. David would try to use every ounce of his manipulation to turn things around. Martha knew this battle was far from over. But as she walked back to her car with Clarice, she couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. David had made a huge mistake, thinking he could control her forever. He was going to regret that mistake. The days following the court hearing were filled with a strange mixture of peace and anticipation. Martha had spent most of her life feeling like she was invisible, nothing more than a backdrop in David's life. But now, for the first time, she felt seen, not just by the law, but by herself. Each morning, she woke up in the quiet stillness of her home. There was no yelling, no slammed doors, no simmering anger in the air. She could finally breathe without the constant weight of fear pressing down on her chest. The house, though, still echoing with the memories of the years she had spent trying to please David, felt different now. It felt like hers again. David had been arrested and was facing multiple charges: domestic abuse, financial fraud, and the manipulation of her bank accounts. The shock of it all had shaken him to his core. He had always believed that his charm, his success, and his control over Martha would keep him untouchable. But Martha had proved him wrong. The truth, once hidden behind closed doors, was now in the light, and David couldn't escape it. But even as Martha felt the relief of seeing David face consequences, she couldn't help but feel the emotional toll of the battle. The wounds from those years of abuse didn't vanish overnight. She still struggled with the fear that had been so deeply ingrained in her, and the guilt she carried for not standing up sooner. There were still days when her mind would wander to David's face, the boy she once knew, and she would wonder what went wrong. One evening, Martha sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, her fingers tracing the edges of the cup as she thought back to the day when everything changed, the day she finally confronted David. The moment she stood up to him was the moment she took back her life. It was the day she realized that she was no longer just his victim. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but she was healing. With the support of Clarice, Brenda, and the legal team, Martha was beginning to rebuild the pieces of herself that David had taken. For the first time in a long while, Martha felt a flicker of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she could have a future where she wasn't afraid of the next phone call or the next knock on the door. As Martha took a deep breath, she thought about the lessons she had learned over the last few weeks. The most important lesson of all was that she had value. She was worthy of love, respect, and peace. No one, especially not her own son, had the right to take that away from her. And now, as the days passed and David faced trial, Martha began to take control of her own life again. She reached out to old friends, started volunteering at the local clinic, and even began looking for part-time work. The future wasn't clear, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. As Martha sat in the quiet of her home, she thought about others who might be in her situation. She thought about the women who were still trapped in cycles of fear and abuse, just like she had been, and she knew that if she could do it, so could they. The journey wasn't easy, but Martha was no longer a prisoner of her past. She was free. So what about you? If you're watching this, maybe you're in a situation where you feel trapped. Maybe you've been manipulated, controlled, or even abused, just like Martha. If that's you, know that you don't have to suffer in silence. There's help. You don't have to face it alone. Martha found strength she didn't know she had, and so can you. If you're ready to take that first step, whether it's reaching out for help, gathering the proof you need, or simply deciding that you're worth more than the life you're living, take action today. Martha's story isn't just hers. It's a story of hope, strength, and the power of breaking free. You can do it too. If you're inspired by Martha's story, I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, share your experiences, and remember, you are not alone. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this story with someone who might need to hear it. It could change their life, just like it changed Martha's. Stay strong, stay brave, and remember, you're worth the fight.